Good afternoon. Can you? Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the panel on the initiative process. The title of the panel is Direct Democracy, Divisive or Desirable. My name is Ted Lasher. I'm only Edward Lasher on my checks, but everywhere else I'm Ted. I'm a professor at Cal State University, Sacramento, and one of my interests is in direct democracy and the initiative process, and I've written about this. And so I'm very pleased to be on this panel today. I'll just offer you some very brief background, and then I'll turn it over to our panelists. And by mutual agreement of all of us, we're going to try to keep to 10 minutes each. I did not bring my kids' water gun, which I'd hoped to bring, but which always tends to do the good job intimidating people, but I think the panelists will stick to it anyway. Let me say first, before I introduce our panelists, that this is a very appropriate topic for this conference on the long-term effects of Proposition 13. I think among political scientists, and probably lots of other people as well, it's well agreed that one of the long-term, maybe the most important political consequences of Prop 13, at least in going beyond the instant issue itself, is that Prop 13 was associated with a revival of interest in the direct democracy process. There's a well-documented increase in the number of initiatives that took place after Prop 13, a well-documented growth in the initiative industry, and clearly greater association of greater use by political officials of initiatives as way as framing debates and making political advances and things of that sort. So it's clearly appropriate that we're talking about this. As a way of framing things, I've asked the panelists to jump off with a couple of the lines of arguments that are made in Peter Schrag's book, and they're also made elsewhere as well. But a couple of lines of critique that find their way, I think, into Peter's book very nicely. One of them is that the initiative process is divisive or undesirable because it may be overly majoritarian, that it may give a way of, in effect, giving more power to majorities against the interests or rights of minorities than we would want. And the second, somewhat different argument, but still an interesting argument, is that in fact, what I'd call it is that initiative process is maybe only pseudo-majoritarian because in fact it gives additional power to the group of people who actually vote on initiatives who are disproportionately high socioeconomic status and things like that. Now there are other lines of critique as well. And at the same time, arrayed against that is a set of arguments that says that the initiative process is necessary as a means of either overcoming a deadlocked legislature that can't address people's problems, or a way of addressing a legislature that's dominated by special interests, and that the argument is that the initiative process may help overcome that. So I think what we're going to be engaged in today is a discussion of issues that are very central to the question of whether we should have an initiative process and what it buys us or doesn't buy us. We have a very distinguished panel up here. Bob Stern on my far right is the author of the book Democracy by Initiative, which has a number of suggestions about the initiative process, which he has here, conveniently enough. He is also former general counsel of the Fair Political Practices Commission, the author of several initiatives, including landmark political reform initiatives in California, statewide initiatives in 1978 and again in 1990. Ooh, can I get this right? 1996?
Yeah, 74.
I'm introducing them in the order that I've asked them to speak. To my far left is Mario Salgado. He's executive director of the California Latino Civil Rights Network. He's been a leader in campaigns against some of the recent ballot initiatives, including Prop 187 and Prop 209. Has spent 20 years in civil rights work, including many years as a civil rights attorney and as a graduate of a small public interest-oriented law school in Los Angeles. Jim Schultz, right next to me on my right, is executive director of the Democracy Center. Do you have your initiative cookbook right here?
Yeah.
Author of the initiative cookbook. And he also is the author of a forthcoming article about the initiative process that will appear in the magazine The Nation, as well as an article that will appear soon in the Sacramento Bee this Sunday. Has his BA from UC Berkeley, which of course I appreciate, and his MA from Harvard. And finally, right to my left is Liz Gerber, who's a professor at University of California at San Diego, previously at Caltech, has done extensive scholarly work in the area of direct democracy, as well as in some other areas, such as the open primaries, and is called on to testify here about that issue. She's a graduate of both undergrad and grad from the University of Michigan, which I should add that since I've come back to California and I realize how parochial we are, for those of you who don't know anything about University of Michigan, it's something like UC Berkeley.
Without a football team.
Yeah, without a football team.
A better football team.
I should say the other way, Berkeley. Okay, without any more ado, I'll turn it over to Bob.
Thank you very much. When we agreed to go 10 minutes, I told Ted that I'm speaking tomorrow in San Diego before the League of Women Voters, and they've given me 3 minutes. So you get the long version today. Hopefully it won't be too long for you. I have some good news and bad news. The good news for you is that there are not as many initiatives on the ballot in November as we've had 2 years ago. By my count, we have 7 initiatives on the ballot as compared to 12 in 1996. The bad news is the spending is going to be at least twice as high, probably 3 times as high as it was in 1996. In talking to campaign consultants, the estimate is that close to $200 million will be spent on the initiative campaigns just in California this November by itself. The gaming initiative, Prop 5, over $100 million is expected to be spent. The Prop 9, the electrical deregulation initiative, probably over $50 million. And then we have a cigarette tax initiative on the ballot that nobody's even heard about. We're raising cigarette taxes, and that's been one of the most expensive initiatives in the past, and that'll be another $20 to $30 million. So if you add that up, it comes to around $200 million. So if you're sick of campaign ads, I'm sorry, you're going to get a lot of them. Now, what do people have more faith in, the initiative process or the legislative process? I think if you took a poll in California, you would find that most people have more faith in the initiative process. And when I go back, and I've challenged audiences in the past, I'll challenge you sort of in your mind to think of an initiative that has passed. Think of an initiative that has passed that was irrationally passed by the voters. One that you think would be repealed by the voters. I couldn't think of any in California. And finally, somebody pointed out one in the 60s that I think it would dispute what I'm saying, and that was the initiative that banned pay TV that passed. I think now California voters would reverse that and would allow pay TV. That's the only one I can think of. I can think of a lot of initiatives that were irrationally defeated, where voters were fooled in defeating them. I really can't think of any of the initiatives, and I disagree with a lot of the initiatives that have passed, but I can't think of any that are on the ballot. If you put them on the ballot again, Prop 13 would be the ideal example, obviously. I don't think anybody in this room would believe that Prop 13 would be repealed. Now, I think, however, the initiative process has some problems, and I think there are 4 areas that need to be addressed when we look at the initiative process. The quality of initiatives, number 1. Number 2, circulation and the electoral approval. Number 3, voter information. And number 4, campaign financing. First of all, the quality of initiatives. Clearly, there are problems in terms of the drafting of initiatives and also in the fact that the initiatives, once you draft an initiative, and I have drafted several initiatives, nobody can draft a perfect initiative. Nobody can draft a perfect legislative bill. But once you've drafted that initiative, and that initiative goes to the Attorney General's office and they have titled that initiative, you can't change a single word of that initiative, unlike a legislative bill, which goes through the process and you can change the bill. That's a real problem with the initiative, and Prop 212 on the ballot in 1996 showed that as an example where they, by mistake, repealed a gift ban imposed on legislators. They repealed it by mistake, and the voters found out about this and turned it down just because of that, and they didn't mean to do it. Now, what's the solution to the problem with the drafting of initiatives? The solution we've come up with is to say that once an initiative qualifies, it goes before the legislature. And the legislature has the opportunity to pass or turn it down. If the legislature passes it, or if the legislature passes it with amendments that are approved by the initiative proponents, then the initiative is taken off the ballot. Now, we had a perfect example of that this year, where there was an initiative dealing with charter schools that had gathered the signatures, and instead of turning in the signatures, they went to the legislature and said, if you pass this measure, we will not turn in the signatures. And the legislature, lo and behold, did. And they didn't turn the signatures, and we have one less initiative to vote on this year. I congratulate them. That was a good thing. Now, that's only going to happen, I think, about 15 to 20% of the time. 80% of the time, the legislature is not going to pass. No, they're not going to pass term limits. They're not going to pass campaign finance. There are a lot of measures they're not going to pass. Then we would say, having gone through the hearings, having had the legislature consider it, we would permit the proponents to amend their initiative to take into account what the legislature has said during those hearings, and the amended initiative goes on the ballot for the voters to approve. Now, the amendments would have to further the purposes. They have to be approved by the Attorney General. But the idea is make the initiative process more like the legislative process. Let the initiative people have the legislative hearings. Don't let the legislature veto what the initiative proponents can do, but let the legislature participate. So that's number one. Number two, circulation and electoral approval. If you have $1 million, you can qualify any initiative that you want, with a few exceptions. A few exceptions, obviously. But if you have $1 million, you can get on the ballot. So what's the purpose of circulating initiatives? Why not just pay the state the $1 million and not go through this process? Give the state a little bit more money, and you're guaranteed it anyway. The circulating a petition is, I think, the worst way of qualifying something for the ballot. It doesn't mean a thing, except that you have enough money to do it, because it requires so many signatures now to get something on the ballot. If it were 50,000 signatures, it might mean something in a smaller jurisdiction, but to have to get 500,000 signatures, I've circulated initiatives. I know what it's like. You say, sign here for campaign reform, or sign here for this. You give them 2 words, and if they want to discuss it, you move on to the next person. You don't engage in a debate with people. They don't have time to do that. So what is the solution to that? Well, one solution might be to increase the circulation time, because right now you're only given 120 days to circulate, 130 days to circulate an initiative, and maybe if you could increase the circulation. But I think maybe the way to do it is to have some other form of qualifying. I haven't come up with a perfect solution on this one. I hope maybe some of you might. One idea is to say you get 50,000 signatures to show that you're serious. Because if you have to get 50,000 signatures, really, that's a lot of signatures. And then somehow the state would conduct a poll on that initiative with the pros and cons and focus groups and so forth, so that people could have both sides to see whether they want the initiative to go on the ballot. Another solution that Dan Lowenstein, who's a professor at UCLA, has come up with is you have to go to the firehouse or a school to sign the initiative, so you have to take an affirmative step. But I haven't come up with a good solution on this one, but there is a problem with circulation. Thirdly is voter information. We're not getting enough voter information on initiatives other than the 30-second spots, but the ballot pamphlet is pretty good. People do read the ballot pamphlet. It has pros and cons in there. It has the AG summary. It has charts. What I'd like to see is an expanded ballot pamphlet. I'd like to see it it is going to be on the internet. I'd like to see more and more information on the web. We have suggested even a video ballot pamphlet where the proponents and opponents actually will debate, and you can get that on the web. The important thing, I think, when it comes to voter information is who's supporting and who's opposing. So that's really important to find out who is behind these measures. Finally, campaign financing. As I pointed out, over $200 million. In 1988, we spent more money on the initiative process in terms of campaigning for and against initiatives than was spent on the legislative process. And this year will be the same way. More money will be spent on these very few number of initiatives than spent on the legislative process. Now, what can you do about campaign financing? The Supreme Court has ruled you cannot limit contributions and you cannot limit expenditures. So that takes care of those problems. But what I'd like to see is more disclosure of who is behind all these ads. When you see Citizens for Better Government, who are the Citizens for Better Government? In 1990, we passed a measure which was declared unconstitutional for other reasons, which said that you had to disclose the top 2 contributors in the TV ad or in the radio ad, and I would like to see that as well. We also think the Constitution should be harder to amend as well. You know, when I think it was 1988 or 1990, one of the few initiatives we passed in 1990 was a measure to ban gill nets. Now, I have nothing against the dolphins and nothing against what they're trying to save the dolphins and the gill nets, but you know that we put that in the California Constitution to ban gill nets? Now, why in the world are we putting things in the California Constitution? Our suggestion is that we increase the percentage of vote needed to pass a constitutional amendment, or it has to come before the public in 2 separate elections. And the state of Nevada does that as well. Now, we're going to have some very interesting initiatives on the ballot. I mentioned you know all about the Indian gaming. You've seen all those commercials. You've seen the commercials, I think, on electrical deregulation, but you've only seen one side on that. I haven't seen any commercials on the tobacco, but we're also going to be voting on banning horse meat. Did you know that? Ally McBeal had a program on horse meat the other night, so they're already talking about it. We're going to be having an initiative dealing with bear traps and trapping animals, and we're going to have some other initiatives. So some of these issues are important, many of these issues are not, and I wish you the best of luck as you go in the polling booth in November and try to decide how you're going to vote on these many measures.
Thanks, Bob. Mario?
From my perspective, and also from, I think, a lot of new voters, new citizens, and immigrants, and I think also people of color, initiatives per se are not necessarily bad, but how they've been used, especially in the past 8 years, have been used to drive a wedge, to basically really, in a very misleading manner, have put initiatives on the ballot that have only hurt and have divided further, I think, California. And it really is not building California for a future that it's coming. I mean, in the year 2015, Latinos will make 41% of the state in California. Now, that shouldn't be alarming. That shouldn't be something that people are afraid of. And it's going to be a state that is basically a multicultural state, a state that is really diverse, and we should be working towards how we're going to make that happen. When Latinos become 41% of the state, doesn't mean that Latinos will all of a sudden make rules to make other people illegal or to basically go after white people, which is some of the reasons that some of the initiatives have been put forward. If you look at Proposition 187, during that time, there was an 800 line in Orange County. And when people called that line, it was basically urging people to vote for 187. And it was telling them, because if they don't, in the year 2010, 2015, white people were going to be banned from California. I mean, some of you and some of us think that's really outrageous, and who would ever believe it? But there's people that believe that kind of hysteria, and that's some of the motivations behind some of the groups that put forward 187. 209 was an initiative that basically, I think, took us back. And then if you asked the question, is there an initiative that hopefully will be repealed? I hope the 209 is an initiative that will be repealed. I think there's people that voted for 209 that are now saying, well, maybe, we didn't really understand what 209 was all about. Maybe that does need to be changed. 227 was also an initiative that, if you look at it, was an initiative that mandated public policy from an educational perspective into an initiative that was not well thought out, that does not address educational problems, that just took a small fraction of the educational system, put it to the ballot, put it in a misleading manner, and now what it will do is it's just causing harm to kids. There's 1.4 million kids throughout the state that need to learn English or need to become proficient in English. This initiative is not going to do it. What we're going to see is a further, isolation and a further problem in the inner cities with kids that are not going to have a chance to really compete for, to go into a good college or go into a good university. So from where I stand, I think initiatives at this point, given the political conditions and given who votes, that if you look at the election, over 70% of the people that vote are over 50 and tend to be white males. It is a problem. It is, and the initiative process is putting forward positions by majority, or in quotes, majority, to impose on minorities, and it's not helping us to really build a state that we need to build. One of the other problems that I have is I think the whole issue of circulation, how they're qualified, how for, immigrant communities, for monolingual communities, it's not explained. People sign initiatives, they don't know what they're signing. And in reality, for example, when the whole discussion is made about economic versus citizens groups, I really challenge what these citizens groups are. Because if you really look at a low-income community, it would be impossible today to have a low-income community put forward an initiative, a state initiative, because they wouldn't have the money. So from a citizen's perspective, it's citizens that have the money, citizens that are well-educated, or citizens that have resources to be able to put an initiative in the process. So if you really look at a low-income community or a minority community with very little resources, it's almost impossible. If you look at 227, there's no way that 227 could have been defeated. We didn't have the money. 226 was defeated because labor put almost 40 million into defeating it. There was no way that 227 could have ever been defeated. We didn't have the money, and we didn't have the access to the media that it would have taken to really do an education. Every time we had a debate on 227, to debate bilingual education, you needed at least 20 to 30 minutes to really explain what bilingual education was, what it had done, some of the successes, some of the problems with it. There's no way you can debate that in 30 seconds. I think those are the problems that we're seeing with initiatives, and I think that it, in a way, is a way to circumvent campaign reform and the problem of making legislators accountable. I mean, I think the figures in 1996, there was more money spent on initiatives than in electing 104 legislators. I think that tells us a lot, that I think we really need to look at how we're going to do campaign reform and how we're going to hold our legislators accountable, and that initiatives should be used in extreme cases. And when you have so many initiatives in the last 20 years, it tells you there's a problem. And I think I totally agree there needs to be reform on how initiatives are qualified and how initiatives are financed.
Okay. We're moving right along. Jim.
You scared us.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Everybody's nodding. I want to start this the way you start all initiative campaigns, which is with a poll. So by a show of hands, I'd like to see how many people will confess to having, in the wee hours of the night, periodic fantasies to abolish the initiative process. Raise your hand. All right. Now, I would like to see a show of hands of those of you who have periodic fantasies in the wee hours of the night of being able to put your very own initiative on the ballot. Raise your hand. I'd like to see how many people, raise your hand if you voted both times.
You have to do the second in order to do
The California has a love-hate relationship with the initiative process. And it's a relationship, it's a debate that goes back to the very roots of the initiative process. I pulled this little gem out of Peter's book, Peter Schragg's book, and I've used it before. There was a debate between father and son on whether to have the initiative process. Hiram Johnson campaigning by car as opposed to the railroads for the initiative process in 1911, telling the railroads to get their noses out of politics, said, quote, "Those of us who espouse these measures do so because of our deep-rooted belief in popular government, and not only in the right of the people to govern, but in their ability to govern." Hiram Johnson's father, a lawmaker and one of the voices for the railroads in California, had a different view. He said of the initiative process, quote, "The voice of the people is not the voice of God, for the voice of the people sent Jesus to the cross." And this remains the debate over the initiative process almost 9 decades later. Some of us see the initiative process and we see the exercise of popular sovereignty. And some of us see it and we see crucifixion. And the fact of the matter is the initiative process has been a good dose of both, particularly in the last 20 years. First point I want to make the essence of the initiative process in California is middle class discontent. It is middle class because that is the vote in this state. As Mario alluded to in a couple of points, in 1994 in November, when Proposition 187 passed by a very strong vote over the objections of a 3-to-1 Latino vote against it, it passed with a 2-to-1 white vote in an election in which, while 53% of the population of California was white, 81% of the people who went to the polls were white, 53% versus 81. In June, when Proposition 227 was again passed by support among whites and rejected among Latinos, arguably the population that was most affected, it did so in a state in which we have a population of about 51% white and about 69% of the electorate white. So it is middle class politics that drives the initiative process. It is about discontent, in that the initiative process is really about, and pardon my language, that always gets people to pay attention, it's about people being pissed off. That's what it's about. People are pissed off about taxes, Prop 13. People are pissed off about auto insurance, Prop 103. People are pissed off about the fact they can't read the signs in their neighborhood because they're in another language, Prop 187, Prop 227. People are venting, and we vent based on a very visceral impression of the initiatives. Nobody reads the initiatives. I mean, I wrote a book on it. I don't think I've ever actually read the text in one of the ballot pamphlets. I may read it somewhere else, but nobody reads all of that. We vote viscerally, and many of us vote based on about 30 seconds worth of impression, usually about being pissed off. And what people are pissed off about are very different things in terms of how the right versus the left in California harvest these things. When you have conservative initiatives, they tend to be about people being upset. I'll tone my language now. People being upset. I don't want, because the PTA, I don't want you to kick me out, Ann. On the right, what we had is we've had a series of initiatives that have really been about race. And this is the first November since '92 that we haven't had an initiative on the ballot put forward that became the dominant issue on the ballot that was basically about race and ethnicity. We had welfare in '92, we had immigration in '94, we had affirmative action in '96, and we, in June, had bilingual education. We've had this stream of initiatives. On the left, we tend to go after corporations, auto insurers, oil companies, and we have these are the two different sides, and there are others, the tax issue, but these are two very big sides of what's happening in California. And it is about harvesting that discontent. And one of the things that has been happening in the state for the last 4 years is what we've seen is initiatives that, Prop 13 was different. Prop 13 was about a genuine uprising that did not take a whole lot of effort to get 1 million signatures to put on the ballot. Immigration was a very different issue. If you track the history of immigration on the ballot, and we did, you may remember there were 3 initiatives put forward that year for potential circulation, only one of which survived, the most extreme of which, one that was circulated by organizations whose newsletters said things like, "Wake up and smell the refried beans." And it was 6 weeks away from being another initiative that never qualified for the ballot when the governor swooped in and the Republicans sent out a 200,000-piece fundraising mailing to put it on the ballot. What we've had for the last 4 elections is this exploitation by the governor of the initiative process, not so much for the policy involved, but for the political opportunity it creates for him at the polls. In 1994, he put immigration on the ballot. In 1996, the governor put Proposition 209 on the ballot. There was a wonderful story. I don't know if people saw this, but there was a conference call that took place in October of 1996 in which Newt Gingrich and the governor had a chat with corporate CEOs from around the country to persuade them to support Prop 209 as a way of helping dole in the House Republican candidates in the state. And Rick Orlov at the LA Daily News got the 800 number, called in, listened to the whole thing, and wrote about it. And the governor was explicit. This is just like 2 years ago when I was running for re-election and Prop 187 was on the ballot. So what we have in the initiative process is the exploitation of middle-class discontent. And I think it's a profoundly different thing when that discontent is exploited for political purposes in the name of crucifying one segment of the electorate than when it's used for broad public purposes. It's what happened in this state on fair housing 30 years ago, and it's what's been happening on social issues since then. And I think the ethnic-oriented initiatives probably have run their course, and I think the next group up for crucifixion are gays with the gay marriage or anti-gay marriage initiative that's going to be on the ballot in the year 2000. To me, this is the deepest challenge of the initiative process right now. It is more than the money issue. It is more than the failure to be able to pass economic initiatives. The challenge right now in this season of the initiative history in California is what will we do about the ability of politicians to exploit the ethnicity issues and now the gay issue in California, not because of the issue, but because it plays well for them personally at the polls. Because the risk here is that people want to get up and take their own turn being Pontius Pilate, except the difference is that this time the crowd isn't leading, the politician is. I would close with this. I take my daughter Elizabeth to vote with me. And when we went out to the election the last time, we went into the polls and I said, "So what'd you think?" And she looked at me and she said, "Well, she's 11. She said, "I liked the yes-no part." And I think that's the way the public feels. They like the yes-no part. Because we live in an era in which we basically don't feel like we have a whole lot of control about much of anything public in our lives anymore. And the initiative process provides people with, whether it's the illusion or the reality, but potentially the option of actually voting for or against something. And that is, to use our luncheon speaker's language, one of the mythologies of California. And it's a mythology that can be used either for the interests of this state or against, and that really is up not just to the people to decide, but to those who would put themselves forward as the leaders of initiative campaigning. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Liz?
Well, thank you very much. I will do my best to stay within the time as everyone else has. But I being the cleanup batter, I guess I can see if I can take a heavy swing, and who knows, it might take me a little longer than the 10 minutes. The title of the panel is Direct Democracy, Divisive or Desirable, and as one of the academic participants on the panel, I will take the typical academic position and place myself directly in the middle of that debate and claim that the answer to that question is maybe yes, maybe no, that it's a matter of degree, and I'll spend the next 10 or 15 minutes trying to explain my somewhat centrist position on this issue. I wanted to, Ted began the panel by asking the panelists to address the question of whether direct legislation, in particular the initiative process, has led to an overrepresentation of majoritarian or perhaps pseudo-majoritarian interests. And much of my research has addressed a related but somewhat different question, adding a third possibility to that representation question, and that is whether or not, in fact, rather than overrepresenting majoritarian interests, the initiative process has in fact represented special interests. And much of the concern with the role of money in the initiative process is either implicitly or explicitly dealing with that question. Is money, presumably money is a problem in the initiative process because it makes a difference. And so the assumption underlying that claim is that, of course, there's a difference being made. In other words, that we're getting different kinds of outcomes by virtue of the fact that organizations and groups with virtually unlimited in a practical sense. Virtually unlimited resources are literally unlimited in their ability to spend on initiative campaigns by a series of U.S. Supreme Court decisions. And so I would add to the list of questions, does direct legislation, and specifically the initiative process, overrepresent majority interests, pseudo-majority interests? I would add a third, minority interests. And here I'm using the term minority not specifically in the terms of racial or ethnic minorities, but generically to refer to policy minorities, that is, groups who may not have broad-based public support. In other words, they have a minority position but may have concentrated resources. And so I've done quite a bit of research on this subject. In your conference packets, you received a research brief from the Public Policy Institute of California summarizing a paper that I've done with their generous support. And I'll be referring to some extent to that and also to some related issues. But for those of you who are further interested in this, you can receive the background paper through their website, and I encourage you to do so and welcome any comments you might have. So the way I approach this question, and I'd like you to think a little bit about it, is to not simply look at one or two examples of how we think the initiative process has gone right or wrong, but to ask in a more general sense, who uses the initiative process, how do they use it, and why? Right? And by thinking about the ability of different kinds of interests to further their agendas through the initiative process, we can learn a lot about what difference it makes, whose interests are served, and what kinds of policies we get to bear on this question of who wins and loses when policy, as in California and in a number of other states, become dominated by the initiative process. So my approach, and one that I think makes a lot of sense in this context and ties into this debate over whose interests are served, is to differentiate between groups with primarily monetary resources and groups with primarily personnel or membership resources. And the reason I think it makes sense to differentiate between these two kinds of groups is, one, they correspond quite generally to this broad concern of, is it majoritarian versus special interests, whose interests are represented. And second, groups with these different kinds of resources really use the initiative process in very different ways and presumably for very different reasons. So how do they use the process? Groups with primarily monetary resources, and these are typically trade associations, businesses, economic interest groups, tend to use the initiative process in a very conservative manner. Okay, they spend most of their money, most of the contributions that they make to initiative campaigns are to defeat initiatives that they don't like. One of the tables in the research brief that you have breaks down spending for and against initiatives by these two contributor types, by economic interests, who are basically firms and representatives of firms, versus spending for and against initiatives by citizen interests, who are basically individuals. They may have economic interests. In other words, these may be taxpayer associations or groups who care about economic interests, but their memberships are not firms themselves or economic organizations. And the striking finding is that economic interests contribute 78 in the 1988 and 1990 California statewide elections, the primary and the general. Of the almost $100 million contributed, 78% of those contributions were to defeat initiatives. Okay? This is not money being spent to pass measures that reflect the preferences of these narrow economic interests. These are defensive expenditures against measures put on the ballot largely by these citizen interests that aim to undermine the influence of economic interests. Right? On the other side of the coin, citizen interests spend a lot less in the initiative process, but the money that they do spend is by and large devoted to trying to pass new initiatives. Okay? Okay? So it is, in fact, these sort of majoritarian interests. Now, we can debate whether or not they're actually representing the actual majority or a pseudo-majority, but nonetheless, these are broad-based citizen interests who are using the initiative process, and for good reason. The measures that they support pass at a much higher rate than the measures that economic interests support. Economic interests have been very unsuccessful in actually passing initiatives. You can kind of go through a mental checklist of some of the big spending economic initiatives that have made it to the ballot in recent years in California. The statewide smoking regulations in 1994, I believe that was. You guys could probably come up with a long list of such initiatives. They tend not to pass, and in fact, most of the money, much of the $200 million that will be spent on this ballot are from these economic interests, yet they are to oppose initiatives that are put on the ballot by citizen interests, right? So I think that's an important point, that is that much of the spending is not being spent for what, if you're concerned about the ability of special interests to pass laws through the initiative process that maybe shouldn't be passed, that aren't in the sort of broader public interest, they're very limited in their ability to do so. Citizen interests, on the other hand, spend much less money in the initiative process, yet the measures that do pass in recent years, some of the social issues that we've been talking about, 187, Prop 13, these are not the big money initiatives that make it to the ballot. These, in fact, do tend to reflect these broader citizen interests. They're supported by citizen groups, not economic groups. Money is necessary. You still need to be able to qualify the measures for the ballot, but it's not sufficient. You also need a broader base of citizen support. Now, that's not to say that economic interests are not able to use the initiative process to further their interests. There are a lot of other ways that they can, in fact, use initiatives to advance their policy interests, largely through pressuring the legislature in various ways. Another project that I'm doing with the Public Policy Institute looks at the ability of groups to actually pass initiatives that constrain the budget process, the legislature's ability to tax and spend. And so in that way, groups that can pass initiatives can actually affect what the legislature does through the initiative process. Now, of course, it involves being able to pass an initiative, and so the same logic applies where citizen groups are, in fact, those who are better able to lock in their preferences through initiatives in constraining the legislature. There have been some examples, though, where economic interests seem to have been able to use the initiative process to pressure the legislature. This spring, a group of Silicon Valley executives formed an organization called the Technology Network. They were interested in charter school reform. I'm certain that there are lots of people in this room and the next that know a lot about the politics of that issue. In brief, the organization drafted and began circulating an initiative to liberalize charter school regulations, and from the onset said that if the legislature passed comparable legislation, they would withdraw their petitions, and that exact process happened. So the initiative process in that case was used not simply by economic interests. This was sort of a mix. It's hard to say whose interests are better served in this area, but certainly this is one example where the initiative process has policy consequences outside of the immediate set of initiatives that pass themselves. In other words, have important influences on the legislative process. Of course, we don't know as much about what those indirect influences are. We can find examples where it looks like the legislature responds to the threat of initiatives, but it's much more difficult to identify exactly whose interests are being served. What we do see is that if you compare initiative states with non-initiative states, on a whole range of policy issues, policy looks pretty comparable. Now, on the micro level, there are some differences. There have been studies that show that in initiative states, you have both lower taxation and lower spending. And there are some differences in terms of redistribution. And in recent years, it looks as though you have differences in civil rights policies, some of the issues that Mario brought up earlier, where the initiative process does seem to have been used to pass anti-civil rights legislation in certain areas, although even there, the empirical evidence is quite mixed. So I'd like to close simply by saying that it's important to understand that groups the initiative process and the groups that use it are not a monolithic mass. It's used for a lot of different reasons. Its original intention was as a complement or a supplement to the legislative process. In some areas, such as tax policy in California, it's really become a replacement for legislative politics. In most other areas, we're talking about marginal movements. In other words, you can imagine a set of policies that the legislature would make, and then the initiative process moves us somewhat closer to sort of a majoritarian populist position. And so when we wonder if this is a good thing or a bad thing, it really depends on your view of the legislative process and whether you think that it's sufficiently responsive to those majoritarian interests. Mr. Schultz's reference to middle-class discontent suggests that it probably isn't, in the sense that lots of people feel that the legislative process doesn't serve them well, and the initiative process has been used as can be used as a balance to what's viewed as a very unresponsive legislative process. To the extent that it oversteps that narrow range in which it was intended and serves as a replacement for the legislative process, then some of these other questions of moving too far in a majoritarian direction may be more of a concern. But certainly the research that I've focused on suggests that the movement is likely not in the opposite direction, that is, further from sort of a majoritarian populist position, and in fact seems to be quite limited in most areas. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Questions on that now to Peter.
Liz, in your analysis, is the governor and the Republican Party that in fact made the difference in getting 209 and 187 on the ballot, are they a citizen group or are they a special interest?
Excuse me, just a second. I was asked before to repeat all the questions. So the question is whether the governor and Republican legislators in getting Republican Party, in getting propositions 209 and 187 on the ballot, should we consider these special interests or not?
Yeah. My approach in this research is an attempt not to have to make those kinds of decisions, again, in typical academic fashion. And the way I've proceeded is, rather than look at a given initiative and say, okay, whose responsibility is this and whose interest does it serve, I've actually analyzed the campaign contribution reports to the committees that are set up to support and oppose all of the measures that I analyze. And those list each individual contributor. Now, to the extent that the parties actually make contributions, transfers between their committees to the ballot measure committees, those contributions I count as citizen contributions. So in fact, I would, all of the analysis then is an attempt not to sort of put a black or white label on the measures, but rather to look at the degree of support from both types of interests. Let me add that virtually every initiative that qualifies for the ballot gets support from economic and citizen interests. And so, it's not a matter of eat one or the other. In some cases, I've actually looked at the sources of majority support. So, in some, I have gone some way in categorizing these measures. But in fact, those measures drew an enormous amount of support from broad-based citizens, from individual contributors, from citizen organizations, not from sort of organized economic interests. And so, I haven't actually broken down contributions to 209 since the state stopped reporting the contributions in the way that they had in the late 80s and early 90s. But I suspect that would be a largely citizen measure. And my argument is that, in fact, the contributions to those measures reflect the basis of support for them. So there is an important question of who the sort of policy entrepreneurs are and how the measures get on the ballot, but at the end of the day, it's the support that they receive from citizens and from voters, and that's what I've tried to look at.
Mario, do you want a chance to?
Yeah. I guess I really disagree on this definition of citizens and also economic interest. If you take 187, 209, and 227 as examples, 187, the people that financed 187 was the Republican Party, it was R.J. Reynolds, it was some of the tobacco companies. There was very few individuals, if you look at the list, if you look at the amount of money that went into 187, that actually funded the yes on 187. Also, in this research, you don't take, I don't know if you took into consideration the 22 million or more that Wilson spent on his reelection. Every single ad that Wilson had vote for Wilson, yes on 187. All his ads were about immigrants running across the border down in Tijuana. So you can't say, just from analyzing the yes on 187 money, you have to take into account all the money that Wilson spent on his reelection, because his reelection was totally based on 187. So there was quite a bit more money that was spent on 187 than was reported. The same thing with 209. So I think that, and also when you qualify the whole issue of citizens versus economic interests, who are the citizens? I mean, a lot of these groups that put forward initiatives, are citizens but from one economic background. It is very much associated with money and having resources to money. If you look at 227, there was like 4 contributors, main contributors, who put forward 227. There were billionaires and people that were close to run-ons, and apart from that, his whole infrastructure and the access that he had. And also, I'm not sure you can really look at it that black and white either, as to analyze whether it's citizens and economic interest. And if you look at the initiative of Prop 5, $50 million or more is being spent by 86 Indian tribes. Are they economic interests or are they citizens? And 50 million or so is being opposed by the Nevada gambling casinos and some other organizations that are against the 5. So I'm not sure that you can really analyze this whole thing from that perspective, because I'm not sure it's so clear that you can say citizens versus economic interests.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
A couple of responses. First of all, in my empirical analyses, I've omitted contributions from candidates, transfers from candidates. So I have considered contributions from political parties as citizen contributions. And indeed, it is the case that economic interests are also represented by parties. I agree with that. I have excluded candidate contributions for obvious reasons, in an attempt not to overstate the personal or individual impact on these measures. I would challenge, though, your claim that these are not citizen interests. I'm not making, for example, that supported Props 187 and 227. I'm not making the claim that these are not class interests, or that individuals who supported these measures did not have some their own personal economic motivations. Nevertheless, these are very much the sort of mass populist measures supported by those sorts of interests, with the addition of a few very wealthy individuals, Ranans and others. But these are exactly the sorts of populist measures that I'm trying to capture. These are, like them or not, representative of a broad-based, conservative, populist set of preferences, at least amongst the voting majority. So my claim is not that they're, good or benign or neutral or something that we ought to encourage. It's simply that they are, in fact, populist measures. Now, they may, as I said, virtually all measures receive some economic support, some citizen support. It's a matter of degree, but the measures that have passed have in fact been those that have received broad-based citizen support. It's conservative citizen support as opposed to liberal citizen support. I'm not sure if the progressive reformers would have actually been pleased that the process is working so much as they had envisioned, but in fact, that's the conclusion that I make. So I hope that I've been careful in trying to be clear that I'm not claiming that there are not economic concerns of the citizens who contribute to these measures, but it's not the sort of wealthy, corporate, narrow, organized special interests that, for example, the anti-Prop 5 campaign is going to be largely dominated by. Those are two different kinds of interests, and it's the citizen interests, the populist interests that have been able to prevail.
Let me turn it to Jim quickly, and then I saw a bunch of other questions out there.
I will be quick, but I can't just let this one sit. Look, Prop 187 and 209, these suckers were on the ballot for one reason and one reason only, and that's because Pete Wilson made a political decision to put them on the ballot. If the Republican Party had not rolled out a fundraising mailing and put paid signature gatherers on the street in the last 6 weeks, that thing would have been a footnote in Peter Schragg's book, and it never would have had any more life than that. Prop 209 would never have gone anywhere if Pete Wilson had not lobbied Ward Connerly to take charge of the campaign and had started doing fundraising for it. It was there for political purposes, and I think that's just dead bang true. And in the case, look at 187, it could have been anything on immigration, right? I mean, you could have drafted something that said, undocumented immigrants have to be tracked when they use public health care, which is what the legislature was talking about. The public didn't vote for 187 because that's what we want. Of all the things we could do, we want to nail those little kids in first grade whose parents don't have documents. No, I mean, the governor probably wouldn't even have written it that way if he'd done his own initiative. It's just that 6 months out from the election, it was this political opportunity floating around in the toilet, and he took it.
Okay.
The panel's been discussing immigration issues and issues in education, but one of the props that passed last year was Prop 215 on a health issue. And when that proposition came around, I was wondering, I voted for it. And I voted for it because two of my grandparents died of cancer. And, I was compassionate to those who were terminally ill. But now I find out that the prop was flawed and there's no distribution methods built into the prop. So I was wondering if the panel could discuss what measures, besides having to put in another proposition to change that, what other methods can we come up with that would change a flawed proposition?
So the question is, when a flawed proposition passes, what can we do about it? Is the question whether what we can do about it now, or what we can do, how we should reform the process to do something about it? Why don't, Bob, you
Well, first of all, I think Prop 215 did not pass, so we don't have to worry. Oh, the marijuana, I'm sorry, marijuana. Marijuana did, okay, right. I was thinking of the HMO initiatives, and Jim and I we have to get the numbers straight. My suggestion is, there are two suggestions. One, the suggestion of having the legislature review the initiatives prior to the time they go on the ballot, and then let the proponents, either have the legislature pass the initiative with the proponent's consent, or have the proponents amend their initiative when they learn some of the flaws. Second proposal is, and this one's very controversial, and that is allow the legislature to amend the initiatives after the ballot. Most initiatives do allow the legislature to amend them if they further the purposes of the initiative, and the legislature generally has been pretty good, but on some of the economic initiatives like insurance, they've actually gutted some of the initiatives, so it's a mixed bag. And then thirdly is the whole question of the court's review, and what we're finding is that single district court judges and their federal judges are tossing out initiatives. Prop 209 was thrown out by a federal judge. It was overturned by an appellate judge. We have suggested in a law review article that that initiatives go before 3-judge panels as opposed to a 1-judge panel, because we think that it would be a fairer test if that were the case. The interesting thing is that the state courts are very reluctant to throw out initiatives. The federal courts are not. And just remember, state courts are elected, federal judges are not. When the California Supreme Court threw out Prop 14, the Rumford Act, back in 1966, it is rumored that Chief Justice Roger Traynor had his bags packed the night that the election was held when he was on the ballot, because he assumed he would be defeated. So there is a problem with federal court judges, or maybe there is a problem with state court judges, but there is a difference between the two.
Let me just add one there. I think Bob was getting at that. I just want to reemphasize it. The one thing to note, just in terms of factual basis about where things are now, is that California is at one end of the continuum with respect to the process not allowing for changes currently. You know, there are other states where it's much easier to change an initiative law. So, other questions? Go ahead.
I'd like to ask the panel in general what your sentiments are about the legislature. It struck me when Mr. Stern made the comment about why a two-thirds vote would then automatically put it into the Constitution. It's pretty clear. You don't want a court to overturn two-thirds of the citizens who voted for something. It's as simple as that. So could each of you address the issue of the legislature's sanctity in this?
Maybe let's repeat the question.
Yeah, okay, the question is, I'm not completely sure I understand it. So is the question how we should evaluate the sanctity of legislative measures versus the sanctity of...
Well, if I were to take down Walter's position, for instance, that basically we have a swamp here, and it needs to be drained, why would you want to allow that very swamp to meddle with the ballot makers themselves?
Okay, so why would we want the legislature to be able to be involved if we think that basically the legislature's a swamp?
Well, I guess it's my proposal, so maybe I should defend it. When I drafted Proposition 9, the other Proposition 9 back in 1974, it was one of the first propositions to allow the legislature to amend it. It was a very complex initiative. It had 15,000 words in it. And we recognized that there's no way that that measure could continue to sort of live without it being looked at by the legislature and amended. And the legislature has amended it about 150 times since 1974, with almost every amendment either making it better or clarifying it. So the legislature has been very responsive on that. When it comes to the auto insurance, Prop 103, the legislature has not been very responsive, has amended it, and the Prop 103 proponents have taken them to court, and the courts have thrown out the legislative amendments. Same thing with the cigarette tax. The legislature tried to steal the cigarette tax money, and they went to court, and the court said, no, you can't do that. So I guess my solution is give the legislature the opportunity to amend the initiatives. As Ted points out, every other state allows the legislature to amend, but also say it has to further the purposes, and then obviously take measures to the courts, and the courts will take a look at that and decide whether or not the legislature has furthered the purposes of that initiative.
Jim, did you want that? Liz?
Sure. I hope I'm not too much repeating the comments I made at the end of my little time segment, but it's clear that to the extent that the people who vote in California are voting on these initiatives because they feel that the legislature is not responding to their interests, the legislature is, at least on some level, not responding to their interests. So I think we need to assess the performance of the legislative process in terms of who it does represent and who it doesn't. It's harder to say who it does represent, and in fact, I'm not even certain that sort of middle-class interests are not well represented through the legislative process, but certainly the perception is so. And so, when we assess the performance of the legislative process, I think we have to be specific about from whose perspective, what kinds of interests are in fact represented, and presumably it's not interests that are better reflected through the initiative process.
Let me exercise the prerogative of the chair and jump in here first. And I just for the record, I think it's an open question whether this legislature doesn't perform that well. And I think it's an open question whether states that do not have an initiative process get worse laws. And to put it mildly, I'm pretty skeptical about that idea.
what's preventing the legislature from being a little bit more responsive to the needs of the constituents? I mean, in your opinion, I know it's such a broad question, but perhaps there's some big issues that be covered. And if so, what reform could you recommend?
This is one of those things where it's like an elephant in the room that's so big you got to back away to see it. I mean, look at the last 20 years. For 16 years we've had divided state government. We've had a Republican in the governorship and Democrats control the legislature. Not a recipe for accomplishing a lot of big picture policy change on the natural. B, we've had very lean budget years a lot of those times. Isn't that right, Fred? And also not a recipe for dealing with things. We've had a wild increase in partisanship in the last 20 years. We've had a phenomenal increase in special interest campaign contributions to the legislature. We have term limits, which has turned the legislature from being a mix of experts and amateurs to mostly amateurs, all of which is a recipe for not doing very much. So in the wake of that, one group after another, consumer groups, environmentalists, the conservative organizations have retooled themselves into being initiative factories, so that there are any number of interest groups now from left to right that have a capacity every 2 years to put what they want on the ballot. Even if we were to get the legislature to become more effective and deal with some of these issues, I think the toothpaste is sort of out of the tube. And the temptation to use the initiative process, I mean, is Jerry Merrill going to stop using the initiative process? I mean, it's too much fun and it's returning too many results. I think that we really are in a situation where, you know, the legislature is the reason we stomped on the toothpaste tube and all the toothpaste went out, but I think we're in initiative mode now, and I'm not sure that we're going to be able to back out of it.
I agree with almost everything Jim has said, particularly with the fact we've had a divided government, but Jim did admit one thing that I'm sure he will recall, and that is it takes a 2/3 vote in the legislature to pass anything with money in it, and any constitutional amendment, anything really that's important. Not very many initiatives get 2/3 vote. And so, in a sense, it's reflecting, the legislature reflects the people pretty well, not all the time, but remember, it does take a 2/3 vote, and Prop 13 probably wouldn't have passed. I guess there was one senator who could have been the one senator who with the 2/3 vote that would have passed property tax relief, and it might have stopped Prop 13. It was because of a 2/3 vote. Now, there are a couple of things, there are many things, at least two things, where the legislature will not respond to the people. One is term limits. I mean, has Congress passed term limits? You know, every state it's on the ballot, it passes. And has Congress passed it? Has any state, maybe one state, I think, that doesn't have the initiative process has passed term limits. And every other state that does not have the initiative process has refused to pass term limits. The people want term limits, and the legislature won't respond. And the second area is campaign finance reform. And the legislatures, I don't care whether it's Congress, whether it's the state of California, whether it's a city, or I just read it was the Mexican legislature, won't pass campaign finance reform because it hurts the incumbents, and the incumbents are the ones who are voting for it. And so those two areas, clearly, in those two areas, that's where we need the initiative process.
Okay, you've been trying for a while, sir. Right,
Oh, yeah.
second.
Yeah, I was going to ask Jim Schultz. You mentioned that most of the electorate really does not match the population, total population of people who are eligible to vote. Particularly, they tend to be older white males like myself.
And like I'm going to be someday.
Pretty soon.
How would you suggest getting more of the younger eligible voters out to the polls to, if only to vote in their own self-interest, which may not be the same, but it's like mine?
The question is about the demography of the initiative.
Yes, the demography of voters is not, I mean, the demography of actual voters is not as the demography of people who are technically
Right.
eligible to vote.
The demography of voters doesn't match the demography of people eligible to vote, and how could we change that? And particularly, how could we get more young voters out to the polls to vote on initiatives?
Some of it is to quote the movie Aladdin, patience, Iago, in that one of the things that will change the ethnic dimension of the electorate is the fact that, particularly as, the Latino community gets older, I mean, as people grow up and get older, they tend to vote more. And the Latino community is much younger than the non-Latino community in California. And so I think that, you know, that's going to change things. But in terms of how we get, for instance, young people out to vote now, it's sort of, you got me. I mean, we put minimum wage, Labor put minimum wage on the ballot, you know? I think that got people out to vote. I mean, self-interest issues, but I'm not sure, other than direct face-to-face contact. You know, there was maybe Mara, you can help me remember, what was the name of that great group in the city that they organized young people around rent control this year? Slackers for, I think it was Slackers Against Prop, whatever it was. And they went door to door in the Mission and to the cafes and to the bars talking to people about rent control. It was retail politics of a very different order than most initiative politics is practiced in this state. There's great organizing going on the ground. I mean, I think it's significant that, according to the LA Times, we went from an 81% white electorate in November 1994 to a 69% white electorate in the June election. You know, there's a story there. So I think that the combination of the issues becoming more focused that are of concern to the non-voters, and of organizing efforts, and of just the aging of particularly the Latino population, I think that will contribute to it some.
Mari, you wanted to jump in.
Well, I hope it's not the aging of the Latino population that will make the difference. I mean, we do see, from 1992 to 98, there's been an increase of 600,000 new Latinos who have voted. So you have a new 600,000 Latinos who are actually voting now on a persistent basis. One of the major reasons is we have to thank Governor Wilson. I mean, Governor Wilson and the strategies of 187, 209, and 227 have motivated a lot of immigrants to basically become citizens, register, and vote. It's an angry vote. It's a vote that is basically voting to defend the rights of their children and the rights of their own community. But it is, it is doing something. It's going to have some implications for the Republican Party also, in that the Republican Party has lost quite a bit of support from the Latino community that they had in '92. In '92, they had 43% of Latinos voting for Republicans. In 1998, they had less than 21%. So there's some repercussions of the Latino vote basically becoming more active. And I think some of the other things that Jim said also is there needs to be a lot more organizing. And I think the initiatives can also have a negative impact on young people and on people getting involved, because I think what it does when people call it that it's mass or that it's broad-based politics, when you look at who votes, and by the votes it actually passes, it is not really broad-based when, for example, 209, the Latino community, the African American community, the Asian community, all those communities voted overwhelmingly against that initiative. So it's not broad-based, and those groups are not special interest groups. So I think one of the reasons why it's what you were saying about the legislature is when it takes $100,000 to elect somebody to the LA school board, there's a serious problem on who we're getting on the legislature, who we're getting on all these elected bodies, and part of it does have to do with campaign reform. And we have to figure out ways to motivate people to vote and to get people in the legislature that will actually represent all those interests, and I think we'll see initiatives go down.
Jack.
If you mind an editorial statement as a legislative employee, it's not a question. In fact, I hope nobody's hesitating. You just heard a lunch speech in which a poet, thinker lays out some very big one-hand, other-hand visions of California. Are we where the United States begins or where it ends? Are we the North or are we the West? Are we the place of leisure or the place of job? And then secondly, you have a legislature which is not a vote of anger, but a place of compromise and common. I thought the presentation of the initiative was being a place for anger. It was brilliant analysis. And then to turn around and say, how come the legislature can't get anything done, is an unfair swipe. The third difference between the legislature and the initiative process you expressed, but I'll say it again, which is a legislature we divide the state into 80 and 40 districts by population, not by number of voters or registered voters. And so you can get 19,000 votes in one assembly district and be elected, and you need 60,000 in another assembly district, 200,000. initiative process, though, is who gets the total number of votes. So the legislature represents residents, and the initiative process is a conservative, it's the last part of the mouth before it finally leaves the python. It's the last gasp to stake some claim to an old vision of California.
There are two things in there, Jack. One thing is this whole notion, and I'd actually like to get the panelists to talk about that first. One is you bring up the notion of the sort of the quality of deliberation in each respective setting, and I wonder if the other panelists could comment, particularly on the legislative process. I mean, what do you think the quality of talk is there with regards to initiatives?
Ideally, the legislative process is terrific. You go through committees, and you go through hearings, and you have debates, and then you hear about these bills that are amended on the last day of the session, major bills amended on the last day of the session. Nobody has had a chance to read them. Nobody's had a chance to analyze them, and these major bills pass. On the other hand, the initiative process, the initiatives are in print for 4 months. The newspapers debate them. We have the ballot pamphlet. We have the pros and cons. Now, again, I think the ideal legislative process is far better than the initiative process. The problem is we don't have the ideal legislative process. I think you're probably right, legislators represent residents, but they also represent voters, and clearly the governor represents voters as opposed to residents, and so I think we have a sort of a mixture at the legislative process. But I think almost probably all of us would agree, ideally the legislative process would be the way to do it. In reality, the legislative process is not working as well as it should.
Yeah. I mean, on that, I think that when you look at the initiative process, and when you're saying that there's ample opportunity for discussion and debate, I tend to disagree with that. I mean, if you look at it, 15% of the people of the electorate actually read the pamphlet. Most everybody else doesn't read the pamphlet. Newspapers do not have the initiatives in full. They have excerpts, and they have their own opinions or their own editorials. And it's up to how much money you can have that you have basically 30-second ads on TV or the radio, or how many debates you're able to get televised. So I'm not sure you really have such an ample opportunity to really debate and find out what the initiatives are about. That's why I think the legislative process is a much better process. It has its flaws, it has its problems, but in the long term, it's a better way of creating the kind of California that we want than the initiative process.
If I could add a little bit to this comment, and that is that no doubt we would all be more informed about politics and hope that our fellow citizens were too. But in my view, that's a long way from saying that we're not making good decisions in the initiative process. The fact that citizens don't read from beginning to end the ballot pamphlet does not necessarily imply that they can't make good decisions on initiatives. And Bob Stern started out his discussion by suggesting that there are probably no initiatives that after having passed and after having played out their consequences that voters really would have gone, oh gee, if we had known what we were voting on, we wouldn't have voted that way. Voters do make pretty good decisions. Now, they may not weigh the long versus short-term consequences or think about the implications for a broader democratic functioning in their in their decisions on individual initiatives, but they do a pretty good job of figuring out where their individual self-interest lies. And if you talk to people, as many surveys and focus groups have done, they get information from pretty reliable sources. They read the pro and con arguments in the ballot pamphlets, which are very informative. They tend to know who's for and against the measures, and in many cases, not necessarily in all cases, but in many cases, that's enough to make at least an immediate short-term interest. Is this in my interest or not? Now, there are certainly other concerns than, is this measure in my immediate short-term interest? But I think it's important to recognize that the lack of detailed information about the content of initiatives does not necessarily mean that voters are making bad decisions. And in most cases, I would argue, they seem to make the same decisions that they would probably make if they did know more about the measures.
We have time for just a couple.
I just want to say one thing, and I will be very quick. The initiative process is not a failure of the people. The initiative process is not a failure of the people. The initiative process is a failure of leadership. Whether an initiative is on the ballot or not is not decided by the people. It's decided by whether you've got enough money to put it on the ballot. What is in the initiative is not decided by the people. It's decided by the folks who put it on the ballot. What the people decide is whether they accept it for what it is or not. And what we have is a failure of leadership. I think the people who have led us in initiative politics have written some pretty crappy, pretty narrow, extreme initiatives that did not have to be written that way. 227 didn't have to be written the way it was. 187 didn't have to be that approach to immigration. The public doesn't vote with a sense of, I know all the specifics, this is the specifics I like. They vote viscerally with what they're presented on, and it is a failure of the leadership, not the people, that we have the you-know-what that we have on the ballot.
Two more, way back.
Well, let me just kind of go with this a little bit. My feeling is on the initiative process is that when you begin to narrow down that voting core, who truly is the direct democracy coming from? And if we were talking about all the citizens, and we could say we were a country that voted 98%, hey, go for it. You have legislature isn't working, then you've got a great initiative process. When we put a social issue before a small core of people, and they vote kind of counter, where basically one race says yes and one race says no. Is that a good initiative? I would argue that's not direct democracy, and I think then what we really have is a different form of representative democracy. The legislature is how it is set up, but when you're talking about it, I guess the question is hey, is it not get back to when that narrow band is written and that narrow group of people are approached, who can read that initiative, you take the time to read the paper, maybe 3 papers hopefully, then maybe you get a good quality analysis. But I really think that what happens is the 30-second analysis, gut reaction, and I'm one of the guys who votes. And if I look at a 42%, what are they predicting for what's going to happen at this election? It might even go lower. When apathy gets involved, now you have a very small band of people making a determination for 32 million. I have a problem with that, and then I think, the initiative. So the question back, or others in the group, where is the problem? Is it really direct democracy if a very narrow band is making a vote?
I'm going to try to play Dr. Laura here and see if I can. What's the question for me? As I take it, the question is again sort of, can we really consider this an appropriate form of democracy if the electorate is unrepresentative? Is that? I'll get.
Maybe get some more questions.
Yeah.
I don't have
Does anybody on the panel want to say anything to that?
I mean, just quickly that, for example, the thing about whether the electorate does good decision or not. Most of the electorate and all consultants that do these political campaigns will tell you, when you go into the ballot box, a lot of people look at what is written there and vote that way. Not most people don't come in knowing exactly what all the initiatives are. And also, when you look at initiatives like 227, when it's 40-60, what happens to the 40% that voted against it? Where is their direct democracy? Where is their rights? Where do they get represented? They go nowhere. The legislature at least has more chances that that's going to be taken care of. In initiatives, if you look at 209, it was 53-47. What happens to that 47% that wanted affirmative action? So I'm not sure that is a way to really promote direct democracy.
Supervisor Collin, I'll give you the last question.
No, mine was just a procedural one because I was concerned about if the initiative process really believe it needs reform, doesn't it also have to be put on the ballot, though?
The question was, does a reforming the initiative process have to be put on the ballot? Some of it does, and a lot of it does not. The legislature could pass it. Many of the proposals that I suggested have been presented to the legislature, And the legislature has declined to pass any reform because they are worried about a backlash of the public if they're tinkering with the initiative process.
I want to thank the audience very much for some very good questions, and thank the panelists for, I think, a very productive talk.